All right, Lucia, welcome to the Interviewist. Lucia is the senior content marketing manager at Vanta, which, if you haven't heard of them, is a very hot tech company in the cybersecurity and compliance space. And Lucia has spent about the past 12-ish years in content marketing and PR, largely in agencies serving both tech and hospitality industries. Lucia, did I miss anything? Is that the
That was
overview?
a good overview of my life. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for joining me today. Just to start with the standard first question, tell me about your involvement with interviewing these days.
So these days, I'm on the side of interviewing thought leaders about these like very high level topics about the future of the industry that they are in, which is cybersecurity and compliance, like you mentioned, and kind of their vision for the future. So very high level topics about kind of like what's coming in the next 5 to 10 years within certain industries.
Very cool. Um, are you interviewing then kind of like executive leaders or more technical like engineers and developers, a little both?
A little bit of both, more executive leaders at this point, and more people that are less tied to like product development per se, and more like setting the structure of what the future of the business is going to look like.
Mhm.
Or even outside of our company, just interviewing thought leaders in the space that are kind of relevant to Vanta and what Vanta is doing. Yeah.
Cool. I have so many more questions to follow up on that, but I'm going to save them so that we can dig in. But first, more general question. Do you feel like you have a particular style or approach to interviewing?
Yes, I feel like the opposite of buttoned up, buttoned down, I would say is my interview style. I very much like try to have a very like authentic, real conversation with people. And I very much am like honest about where we are meeting in the middle because I'm talking to a lot of very technical people, very technical thought leaders. I always have in my 12 years. I've worked with a lot of tech companies and tech thought leaders. And at the end of the day, I'm a content marketer and I understand the tech world, but I'm not a tech practitioner. I'm not a developer. I'm not a security expert. So I like to just lay it out on the line and like come to the table and say, hey, there are things I understand and there are things in your world that I need you to kind of like bring me into. So that's my buttons down approach of I'm not trying to pretend I'm smarter than I really am.
I love that, the button down interview approach. This was one of my big questions for you, kind of working in this, because I know you've said you're doing largely high level things, but you're still in a fairly sophisticated space, compliance, cybersecurity. So when you're talking to these more technical people or even executives in a technical space where you're like, I'm not an engineer, I studied English or words, how do you prepare for those interviews and kind of approach that transparency question?
I think the best thing to do from like a preparing perspective, I mean, it's the same way that I would approach like a job interview or anything, like just doing the research about the person. Like you're never going to understand everything about the space, but just understanding what their experience is and what they have written in the past to understand their like slice of the space is how I like to approach it, just to make, some like big ocean of a concept feel a little bit more palatable for you as someone that's not an expert in whatever it is. So I always
Yeah,
like to come prepared, especially with like if they've published any content before, I like to know what they've said and kind of how they've approached it. So I have at least that in my back pocket.
totally. Have you, I'm asking this because maybe I'm projecting, but have you ever been in an interview where you're like, they're saying this thing and I just have zero clue like what they're trying to say or explain to me?
A
And if you,
million times, yes.
what do you, are you pretty upfront, like, I don't understand, or do you kind of work your way around it? What's your approach to that?
Okay, so I have two specific things to say about this. One, like in addition to my buttoned down approach, I have another kind of philosophy when I'm interviewing. of, when you go shopping and you try on something and in the dressing room you don't necessarily like it, but you buy it and you're like, maybe it'll go with this like top
Yes.
that I have, or like maybe at some point I'll wear it, but that never ends up happening. If you don't like it in the dressing room, you're not going to like it when you go home. That's exactly how I feel on interviews. I know like people learn things in all different ways. For myself, I know if I'm not understanding something in the moment when I'm talking to someone, I
Hmm.
can't back out of it afterwards and review my notes or review something and teach it to myself. I really need to understand it in the moment. So with that in mind, like I constantly am saying to people, let me repeat this back to you so you can tell me if I'm understanding correctly. That's like a phrase that I go back to all the time. And then I try
Love
to
it.
say things in my own words to make sure that I understand, because I've just learned over time that that's how I personally absorb information and understand information. And if I don't understand it during the interview, I can't back out of it later.
Yeah, I love that. I think doing that too, kind of like the summarizing in your own words approach, shows the person you're interviewing that you're listening to and engaging. Because I
Mhm.
think sometimes, like when you see the eyes glazing over, people lose motivation. They're like, this
Yeah.
person has no clue what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah, and it's really helpful too because like I was on an interview yesterday with an extremely technical person who like, he even told me, he was like, I think 7 years in the future, I don't think about the present. And so it was
wow,
a tough conversation to follow. And I did, this like hack a few times of let me repeat this back to you and make sure I understand. And there were very specific instances that he was able to say like almost, but not quite, and correct like certain elements of the way that I was understanding it. So it just like proved to be very useful in that context.
amazing. Awesome. I'd love to dive into that because I think you get to interview for like a very interesting, like you said, technical, but looking so far in the future. Um, One thing in B2B especially, I think both internally and externally, B2B gets this bad rap of being boring and pretty stale. So kind of how do you approach these interviews, especially working in like compliance and security? People don't usually imagine those as the spiciest topics. How do you kind of approach those to try and pull interesting or engaging content out of them?
That's a really good question. Well, personally, I think that cybersecurity is very spicy and exciting, but I found, particularly in cybersecurity, it doesn't work for every industry, but relating every topic to a specific story of like when this type of cybersecurity incident caused, XYZ problems for a certain company, or like when this type of vulnerability, like proved to be really detrimental for a company is super useful. So just putting like real world examples and stories to contextualize whatever the technical topic is, I think makes the most sense, and it's just like a really relatable way to talk about some of these things, because whenever you can put something, for example, cybersecurity, it's so easy to talk about like a vulnerability or like a type of hacker, profile or something like that. But then when you put it in terms of like, this is exactly what happened with XYZ breach, which you as a regular person probably know about because you got a notification from your credit card company that your, credentials were hacked or something like that, um, is the best way that I've found to do it, especially in the cybersecurity world.
Totally. No, that makes sense. I think kind of that's like the so what part, right? Like,
Yeah.
why does this matter? Here's like concrete examples.
Yeah. The other thing too, actually, this came up yesterday, the same call that I was talking about earlier, analogies of like, okay, so this is how it works in this world. Can you explain to me like something similar, in a different industry or something like that is a really good way to contextualize it as well. For example, yesterday we were talking about new like methodologies, for approaching security. And we were talking about how, like, in the world of development, when Waterfall moved into agile development, it was the same kind of like methodology shift, and just kind of taking it outside of the context of what you're talking about and finding a new industry to kind of like tack it onto is really useful.
Yeah, I love that. Do you feel like, so I know you're primarily doing content marketing now, but you have a lot of experience in PR too. Do you feel like your experience in PR has impacted kind of how you interview and talk to people in content marketing or vice versa?
Yes, in a few ways. I think like when I was starting out in PR, my role on interviews was kind of a middleman between the reporter and the thought leader. So my job was to prepare the thought leader for the interview by doing like really extensive briefing books where I would like understand the motivations of the reporter, what they typically write about, how they approach different topics. So I think that's helped me from the perspective of like researching and preparing for interviews and
Mhm.
distilling a lot of content down to, what could they potentially ask about and what angle could this take? Um, but also, like, I don't know if this is a little snarky, but coming, like, I think I come at interviews a little like skeptically,
Say
because
more. Yeah.
it's in PR because I think a lot of times, I was on calls with my clients and a journalist, and you're trying to sell the journalist on writing about whatever topic, your company, whatever, press moment you're having, or, whatever your vision for the future is. And reporters are just naturally a little skeptical and they want to like poke holes in whatever it is that you're doing, especially with tech startups. So I
Mhm.
think that like sometimes I approach naturally my like line of questioning a little bit skeptically of like, why is this important? Like, but what about this? Could this be a roadblock to this vision happening? Which I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but definitely stems from, the PTSD of PR.
I feel like it probably, I mean, is good for the person you're interviewing in the long run because I think like sometimes, especially executives, can get in a talk track. And if you have someone who's being a little bit more critical, maybe that kind of breaks them out of the thoughts that they've prepared in their head ahead of time.
Yeah. It's also like, I mean, reporters, like sometimes you can get away with, it's a story about your particular company or your particular product or whatever, but I think it's given me like a really critical lens of, is this content too self-serving, or is this actually something interesting to like a broader platform of people? And when you're writing thought leadership content, that's so important. So I think that's been a really good lesson learned from the PR side.
Yeah. Do you have any other interviewing tips around kind of thought leadership topics? Because I think one of the hardest things, like there are so many executives who want to be thought leaders these days, but also don't want to say anything too spicy. So, kind of how do you approach thought leadership interviews to get good thought leadership, I guess?
I mean, I think there's like practical advice, and then there's kind of like, uh, let me start. So the practical advice, like I never like thought leadership interviews to go for too long.
Ooh, interesting.
I don't like to schedule interviews for longer than 45 minutes because I think like you would think the longer the amount of time, the better, but it's just not true. Like you need to keep people focused. And if you give like too much time to kind of
Hmm.
speak, about the future and about these high level topics, I think it just gets a little convoluted.
Hmm.
So less time is better. And if you need to follow up, you need to follow up. I think too, though, like you just have to keep in mind you can't create a thought leader out of anybody. They
Hmm.
have to be willing to have those spicy takes, willing to put them out there, and then willing to like, I mean, this, do the work to review content, to work with a content partner to create things. And I think
Hmm.
you just like can't always fit a square peg in a round hole. Like sometimes it's just not going to work out. You need to find the right person to be that thought leader.
Yeah, we can't pull the thoughts out of your brain and then.
Exactly. There's only so much we can do. I've been on so many interviews where it's like pulling teeth, and it's just people just don't want to be that person, and that's okay. They might be the keeper of the knowledge, but if they're not going to do the second step to be the promoter of that knowledge, it's not going to work out for anybody.
Totally, totally. Do you have, is that your kind of non-practical take then on getting good thought leadership?
Yeah, you can't make anybody a thought leader.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. Um, what else? Oh, one thing I wanted to pick your brain on. I thought this was a really interesting part of your career biography that you're in like deep tech and have done a lot of work in tech, but you also worked in hospitality, which to me feels like so opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So, can you talk about that? Like, did you do interviews in hospitality and did you approach it differently or kind of the same? What is that world like?
Um, The content that I was creating in the hospitality world was much more straightforward. So it was a lot more like SEO plays and kind of like travel advice.
Hmm.
So there was interviews on the travel advice side where you're talking to someone who's like a local in the area and you're asking like, oh, when you're here, what type of stuff do you like to do that, we should like write about and tell other people about. So I think the fundamentals are the same. Like you just want to make people comfortable and you want to get their like honest opinion about things, but the stakes definitely feel a little bit lower when you're asking someone like what their favorite restaurants in the area are versus like what they think like how we're gonna rein in AI to be like useful in our future.
Yes, AI has not hit hospitality
Yeah, not quite as
reviews.
hard.
Less mental grinding on your part. Awesome. Do you have a most memorable interview? And if so, why?
Um, I have like a bad experience. I definitely, every interview that requires pulling teeth, like naturally gets just like burned into my brain forever. I
Yes.
can't like think of specific instances, but I know like there's been times when I've had to end interviews early because it's just clear that, the person is like not willing to speak and it's just not going to work out that day, which I think is totally fine. Like you have to realize like people are people and sometimes they're just not going to have it.
Hmm.
But a memorable experience I have actually preparing for an interview, which kind of goes back to my idea of like, if you don't like it in the dressing room, you're not going to like it when you take it home.
Yes.
I always send people that I'm interviewing questions at least 24 hours beforehand. Not, and I say the same thing every time I say, this is not for you to do homework. I just want you to be
Hmm.
prepared and understand the types of things that I'm going to ask about. I don't always stick to the script, but just giving them a sense of what we're going to talk about. And I had a manager of mine look over my list of questions that I had like carefully curated for this person. This was really early on in my career. And she looked at it and she said to me, do you understand any of these questions? And I was like, no, like to be honest, I don't. Like I was just trying to sound really smart and pretend that I understand this like, deep tech thing that I don't. And that really stuck with me because that's kind of like where the philosophy of if you don't like it in the dressing room, you're not going to like it when you go home kind of stuck with me because she said, this is not going to be useful to you if you're trying to like meet the thought leader where they are instead of like meet in the middle so you can create something from what they have to offer.
I love that. That also strikes fear into my heart, but great job on that manager calling that out for you.
I know. These are the things that happen when you're early on in your career.
Ooh, bad times. Rough days. Do you have any other kind of underrated interviewing tips? I know you've already given us a ton, but anything else come to mind?
I mean, my biggest things are, yeah, I like to, if possible, cap it 45 minutes. I always send questions beforehand. My like repeat phrases that I always say are, let me repeat this back to you to make sure I understand. Oh, I do like to end interviews. I typically always end interviews by asking, is there anything that I haven't asked you today that like you think is interesting, even if it doesn't have to do with the topic that we're talking about? Because, as much as like, I can do my research and figure out what I think would be interesting based on someone's expertise, like they're the only one in their mind and they might have read a really interesting article that morning or something that
Mhm.
they just are excited about, and I think it sparks a lot of good ideas.
Ooh, I love that one. I feel like I often ask, is there like anything else you want to talk about? But I like the tip of expanding it to like, it doesn't have to be on just this conversation
Yeah.
too. So I feel like that's when you get the stuff that makes up 90% of what you're
Yeah,
writing.
exactly. Oh, I do have one more too. I always would coach when I was managing people, I would always coach them to do this, providing context at the beginning of the call.
Hmm.
Always. Like a lot of times I have found that, especially when you're interviewing technical people that they're not marketers,
Hmm.
they don't always understand like what the interview is for or what way you're going to use it. So they can start a little bit on the defensive, thinking like if you're recording the call, for instance, they could be very nervous that you're going to be like, taking video clips and quotes and things like that and using that. So just explaining like from the top of the call, this is a fact-finding mission. Like I'm going to take the information that you give me and I'm going to do this with it. Is just really useful, even if you've done it before in like an email, just kind of starting
Hmm.
the call with that to put people at ease, I think is another good tip.
Yeah, I think like that comes down to ultimately just no one wants to sound dumb and
Yeah.
they don't want to like be recorded saying something that another super smart person might think is
Yeah. Or like they're nervous about going against some sort of like internal protocols for, saying something that's like related to like the IP of your company or something like that. And so just like the understanding of like everything that I write, I'm going to send to you so you can review it before it goes anywhere. Just putting people at ease in that way.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any kind of interviewing inspirations, muses, role models? And this can be tech, journalism, pop culture, anything.
I think it was interesting. Like, I was thinking about this question, and I think it kind of like you kind of take inspiration from everywhere in your life. Like, I used to do improv, and so like, yes, and was I based my whole life off yes, and every interview I approached with like a yes, and mindset of like, how
Mhm.
can I build off what this person is saying? I think like, now I have two little kids, and I read a lot of parenting books and this whole concept of like, saying less to your kids to get them to like open up and talk about their emotions and how they feel is really resonating with me. So like, for example, I'm reading this like parenting philosophy where instead of, saying to a kid like, "Oh, you seem really upset," like that must have really upset you, and kind of like putting the emotion on them, you just say like, "Tell me more." Like, how did that make you feel? And just like little tweaks like that, like kind of I feel like will naturally come into play with what I'm doing at work because it's what's happening outside of work.
I love that. See, if I had kids, maybe I'd have even better interviewing skills here.
Just read the parenting books. They're really useful.
I
I
love
also do,
it.
like a ton of podcasts. So like I not all interview podcasts, but like Dax Shepard, like Armchair Expert, like I listen to a ton of stuff like that. So I'm sure I naturally pick up on a lot of like isms that those people have just from listening to them all day, but I can't think of anything concrete.
Do you, this is a little tangential, but I love interview podcasts too. Do you have kind of like any questions in your back pocket where you're like, these are my backup questions and I can always whip them out if I need to or anything like that?
I mean, I would probably call the question of like, what did I not, what did I not ask you about that you're, into lately? That's probably one that I have in my back pocket. What do you like to read? Or like, what are you,
Mm.
if I'm ghostwriting for someone, especially, I like to know what type of stuff they like so I can understand if there's like a particular like voice or tone that they go for,
Yeah.
that they really want to be like represented as. Trying to think if there's anything else. No, I do a lot of like on the fly. Like I prepare questions, but I really like kind of pride myself. I think it's my like beginnings as an improv actress. Like, I pride myself on just sort of yes-anding my way through the interviews.
I love it. Okay, interview training for future
Yeah,
writers. Button down, become a parent, take improv.
yes.
Check.
There we go.
This is some amazing advice. I'm through all my questions, but is there anything else that I should be asking you about?
Look at you. You did it. No, I would just say like, I mean, that's one thing I think I can't reiterate enough. Like, you can't stick to the script all the time in interviews. I think one thing I noticed, like, when I was managing people who would interview other people, and I would sit in on calls and kind of be like, someone who was listening into other people interviewing, that's something that I would notice a lot with like people who are a little bit more junior in their career or aren't as confident with a topic. They just want to stick to the script because they're afraid of kind of sounding like they don't understand something. But
Hmm.
like the best advice that I was given early on and that I follow to this day is just like you can't be afraid to say that you don't understand something. Like that's totally fine. Like you're not an expert in something that someone else is an expert in. So just ask the questions and don't be afraid.
Yeah, I think someone phrased it less elegantly to me. They were just like, it's okay to sound dumb.
Yeah, it is. It's okay to sound dumb.
Yeah.
Like you can't be good at everything. Like you're a good writer, and they're
Yeah,
a good technical expert or whatever it is. So
exactly.
yeah.
Cool. Well, that's all I got. Alicia, thank you so much for chatting with me today and giving us all your smart and interesting tips.
Of course. Thanks for having me.